Good evening, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're watching the numbers rise. It's great to be with you. So welcome all to this evening's program, Color, Caste, Denomination, Emily Dickinson's Race and Class Context, brought to you by the Emily Dickinson Museum. I'm Brooke Steinhauser. I'm program director at the museum, and we're delighted to be here with you. At the Emily Dickinson Museum, our mission is to spark the imagination by amplifying Emily Dickinson's revolutionary poetic voice from the place she called home. During the pandemic, we produced a comprehensive plan for the work that we will do to serve that mission and produce work that's vibrant and vital for our time. And now in our 20th year at the museum, we are fortunate to see every day in our constituents the impact of Dickinson's story and poetry, and we are keen to continue interpreting her life and work in ways that have meaning and relevance to an ever more diverse global audience. So tonight's program places Emily Dickinson and her revolutionary poetic voice within its 19th century New England context here in Amherst, Massachusetts, where she penned her startling verse. We believe that in order to appreciate the ways in which Dickinson's work was revolutionary, we must also understand some of the ways in which she is not, in which she is truly a product of her historical moment. So tonight's presenters are 4 museum guides who have spent months researching often hidden histories and providing us with a foundation from which to continue this critical work. So we hope that you'll join us in this journey of context and discovery, and that you will find your spark of inspiration and perhaps pursue your own inquiries that arise from tonight's program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We are going to begin with Becky Lockwood, who will begin our program with a look at the history of the Dickinson family in New England and the Connecticut River Valley's indigenous people.
Hello, everyone.
I think we're gonna show you Becky's face in just a moment. There we go, perfect. And then we'll hear from Judith Hudson, who will walk us through decades of change in Amherst demographics during Dickinson's lifetime. Then we'll hear from Pete Reddington, who will explore Dickinson's musical landscape. Hey, Pete. And then we'll hear from Emily Bernhard, who will discuss sites of industry, both in and outside of the home in Dickinson's Amherst. A Q&A will follow the presentations tonight. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can in a short amount of time, but please feel free to pop your questions into the typed Q&A feature in your Zoom bar. That's in your toolbar. That's where we're going to look for your questions. So now, without further ado, over to you, Becky. And I'm going to hop into a screen share.
Thank you, Brooke. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Dr. Margaret Bruchak is a scholar and historian of Abenaki descent. I introduced this section of the presentation of Emily Dickinson's native place with her words, Dr. Bruchak's words. We acknowledge we stand on indigenous land. We are guests on this land. Emily Dickinson considered Amherst, Massachusetts to be her home. Although the poet was born here and referred to Amherst as her native town, her association with this place was brought about by the immigration of European settler colonizers and their occupation of the lands of native people, the original occupants of the land. We'll go to the next slide. Here you see Mount Sugarloaf. It's not far from Amherst. A native creation tale passed down through many generations of the native people of the Connecticut River Valley explains the origin of South Sugarloaf on the left and North Sugarloaf on the right as the head and body of a giant beaver killed in a fight by the spirit Hobomok. David Brule, scholar and historian whose tribal affiliation is with the Nahantic people, presently lives in Montague, Massachusetts, and has written land acknowledgements for organizations and businesses. The following is a brief excerpt from one he has written. We must acknowledge that we are occupying and benefiting from this indigenous land upon which we stand. upon which our personal homes and businesses are located. This is still the homelands of the Pecumtuck and neighbors. They're not gone. They are in the air that we breathe. Their voices linger in the landscape and riverscape. And the next slide, yes. Scholars estimate that the first native people arrived in the Connecticut River Valley about 15,000 years ago. The Algonquin people included many groups of Native Americans from Canada, New England, and the eastern portion of New York State, including those in the Connecticut River Valley, all sharing a language that has common elements. In the Connecticut River Valley, the term Algonquin includes Agawam, Tawas, Pecumtuck, Nonotuck, Quabig, Quinnipiac, Waranoco, and Sococo peoples. David Brule states that the archaeologists estimate that there were approximately 12,000 native people in the Connecticut River Valley in 1630. The Nonotuck, also called Norwatic people, lived near and in the area of Amherst. The Pecumtuck lived in the Northampton and Deerfield areas, and the Nipmuc lived in central Massachusetts. All of the groups of native people were fluid, traveling to and from other locales and joining together with each other. Massachusetts is named after the Massachusetts native people who lived in the area of present-day Boston. Now we'll turn to differing views of treaties and land ownership. In this next slide, you can see a wampum belt. It's Iroquois. The settler colonizers who came to Massachusetts in 1630 included Emily Dickinson's early ancestors. They entered into treaties with the native people, offering wampum as payment. Wampum is a sacred bead made from whelk and cowhog shells. One use of wampum by the native people was as a way to affirm and honor agreements. When the native people entered into treaties with the settler colonizers, they understood the agreements as intent to share the use of the land. Many of the settler colonizers viewed wampum as money and viewed the treaties as giving ownership of the land. Now, in this next slide, you can see this is an image from the 1860s, and it depicts Pecumtuck people at a trading house in Springfield, Massachusetts. The trading houses were a place where settler colonizers and native people met to sign agreements concerning land and the trade of items, particularly beaver pelts. In 1658, John Pynchon, a Springfield trader, brokered a deed with the native people of the area regarding land that is now the part of the town of Amherst. Dickinson's ancestor, Nathaniel Dickinson, paid John Pynchon for a tract of the land. The settler colonizers allowed their livestock to roam freely outside of their settlements, ruining native plantings by eating corn and uprooting crops. They cleared and planted fields and fenced off land areas. Gradually, the native people were forced from the land they had always used for hunting, fishing, and growing crops. In July 1689, the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared that each soldier would receive 8 pounds out of the public treasury for each Indian scalp. Scalp bounties increased to 10 pounds, then 20, and then by 1723, 100 pounds. This was one additional method of taking over the lands of the native people by murder and displacement of their families and ways of life. The words of Massasoit, a great leader of the Wampanoag people, convey the view of many of the native people. Massasoit said, "What is this you call property? It cannot be the earth, for the land is our mother, nourishing all of her children, beasts, birds, fish, and all people. The woods, the streams, everything on it belongs to everybody and is for the use of us all. How can one person say it belongs only to them?" As the beaver disappeared due to the increased hunting and sale of the pelts, it was increasingly difficult for the native people to pay for goods and services gained from the settler colonizers with those pelts. The settler colonizers then used the debt owed them to gain control of the lands. These are words of a settler colonizer in Northfield, Massachusetts, referring to a deal with a native person regarding trade for beaver pelts. He said, "I trusted Ampachala on one red coat and 2 knives. If I'm not paid in beaver when he comes back from Sokoke, all his land is to be mine." Tensions grew between the settler colonizers and the native people over the use and misuse of the land. As the native people were increasingly forced from their land, raids and then war between the two groups occurred. Dickinson's ancestors, Joseph and Azariah, sons of Nathaniel Dickinson, fought in raids against the native people. In the Deerfield raid of 1704, Dickinson's ancestor, Sarah Dickinson, was captured by the native people. The words of 2 Arapaho songs from a later time, the time of the ghost dances, which began in 1869 as a spiritual movement, evoked the pain the treatment of the native people endured at the hands of the settler colonizers. The first song is "My children, when at first I liked the whites, I gave them fruits." And the second, "Father, have pity on me. I am crying for thirst. All is gone. I have nothing to eat." In 1731, 3 generations after the Dickinsons of England landed in North America, the first of Emily Dickinson's ancestors established a homestead on land that would become a part of the town of Amherst. Their grandchild, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, would experience the birth of a granddaughter whose poems were inspired by the town's landscape and people. By the year of Emily Dickinson's birth in 1830, the settler colonial Dickinsons had established themselves through ownership of land formerly occupied and cared for by Native people. The foundation upon which the Dickinson family's wealth rested on the land of the Native people. Now we'll turn to the Native people in Amherst and the area during Dickinson's lifetime. By the mid-19th century, although they'd been forced from their lands and traditional ways of life, Native people were still living in the Connecticut River Valley, and they were part of Emily Dickinson's Amherst. As the Native people were forced from their land, they adopted Anglo-American dress, dwellings, and lifestyles. In this drawing here, you can see that the Nipmuc women selling baskets have adopted elements of the clothing of the settler colonizers. In spite of the systemic prejudice against them, some Native people became much sought after healers in New England. Rhoda Rhodes was one of the popular Native healers. She was born in 1751 and she died in 1841 at the age of 90, just 11 years after Dickinson was born. She lived in Indian Hollow in Western Massachusetts and was a successful physician caring for people in Springfield and Northampton, Massachusetts, both places near Amherst. She sold what she called the extract, a medicine made of medicinal vegetation grown in the woods and in her garden. A neighbor of hers, Deacon Ellis, wrote of her, "Old Rhoda could cure anyone outside of the grave and almost those who had lain in it only a little while." Emily Dickinson studied botany in school and had contact with family friends, Edward and Ora Hitchcock, preeminent geoscientists. As an adult, Dickinson wrote to a friend remembering reading Dr. Hitchcock's catalog of plants growing in the vicinity of Amherst, published in 1829. Dickinson writes, "I used to read Dr. Hitchcock's book on the flowers of North America. This comforted their absence, assuring me they lived." Stephen West Williams was a Deerfield physician. Between about 1816 and 1818, Williams collected samples of medicinal plants of Massachusetts with Edward Hitchcock, later president of Amherst College. Williams was assisted by Abenaki Louis Watso and published an herbarium. Much like the herbarium of Dr. Williams, about 30 years later, Dickinson created her own herbarium, which contained 2 plants used by Native Americans for healing, the common yarrow, and the choke cherry. Dickinson also grew two medicinal plants used by Native Americans in her garden, hepatica, or American liver leaf, and bloodroot. There is no evidence that Dickinson used these plants medicinally. Was she aware of their use by Native healers? Was she aware of the indigenous knowledge of the Native people? That's not known. Many Native people continued to live the traditional way of life, traveling land to hunt, fish, and cultivate crops. Many also made baskets, often of ash splint, and brooms and other household wares to sell to the settler colonizers. Prejudice and bigotry were a part of Dickinson's life in Amherst. Catherine Maria Sedgwick published a novel called Hope Leslie, or Early Times in Massachusetts, in 1827, 3 years before Emily Dickinson was born. The romance novel about Native people in the English contains tones of fairness towards the Native people. The book is in the Dickinson family library, but it is not known whether Dickinson read it. In June of 1838, when Dickinson was 8 years old, the disparagement of the Native people is evidenced in these words from a local newspaper, the Northampton Courier. And it said, "The miserable remnants of a tribe of Indians from Canada, squatting in the woods a mile or two from town, have been and continued to be the lions in this vicinity. They are a slothful, ragged, dirty, squalid race." In 1869, Dickinson was 39. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Old Town Folks. Stowe was a family friend and occasional visitor to the home of Dickinson's brother, Austin. In this book, she describes the descendants of the Native Indians as a roving, uncertain class of people who are always falling into want and needing to be helped, hanging like a tattered fringe on the thrifty and well-kept petticoat of New England society. When Dickinson was 50 years old, the Amherst Record of August 1880, a newspaper the Dickinson family received, reported, "The poor Indian has arrived, and a party of such nationality is in camp at East Street." East Street was not far from the homestead. The Native people were in Amherst to sell their woven wares. There are few extant references from Dickinson to the Native people living in or traveling in Amherst. But when she was 51, she wrote to a friend, "The wanderers came last night. Austin says they are brown as berries and as noisy as chipmunks, and feels his solitude invaded as far as I can learn." Was Austin being disrespectful of the Native people? Why was Dickinson repeating Austin's words? It's difficult to know for sure. That same month, Dickinson wrote to a friend about a visit by a Native person selling baskets. She said, "I was touchingly reminded of your little Louisa this morning by an Indian woman with gay baskets and a dazzling baby at the kitchen door." This too, at first glance, seems wistful, but with more thought, seems condescending. Native baskets were used in New England households in the 18th and 19th century. They used them for sewing or work baskets to carry cheese and garden produce, hat and bonnets baskets, and as gift baskets. Today, the Emily Dickinson Museum still contains several baskets and brooms identified as native made. William Henry Hawkins, an Afro-Indigenous employee of the Dickinson family, worked at the homestead beginning in the 1870s when Dickinson was in her 40s. He married Mary Warren, who was born in Mexico in 1848. Mary was a housekeeper and William was a gardener. They had 2 children. After his first wife died, William Henry Hawkins married Mary Elizabeth Powers Thompson, becoming the son-in-law of Charles and Eliza Thompson, also employees of the Dickinson family. Mary and William had 10 children. Did Hawkins speak of his heritage? Did Dickinson, an avid gardener, spend time working in the garden with Hawkins? Unfortunately, no reference by the poet to Hawkins survives. Helen Hunt Jackson was born in Amherst in 1830, 2 months before Dickinson was born. They later became friends, with Jackson visiting Dickinson twice, in 1876 and again in 1878. Jackson became a passionate advocate for the rights of Native people, writing a book entitled A Century of Dishonor in 1881. Jackson distributed a copy of her book to every member of Congress. In this book, she writes, "What an opportunity for the Congress of 1880 to cover itself with a luster of glory as the first to cut short our nation's records of cruelty and perjuries, the first to attempt to redeem the name of the United States from the stain of a century of dishonor." During 1883 to 1884, Jackson wrote her most famous work, Ramona. Ramona is a novel about a Scottish Native American living in Southern California who suffers racial discrimination and a difficult life. In a letter written to Helen Hunt Jackson when Dickinson was 55, she states, "Pity me, however, I have finished Ramona." As a friend of Jackson and a reader of Ramona, it seems probable that Dickinson was aware of the way the Native people were treated during her lifetime. In conclusion, it is critical to consider that the power and privilege held by the Dickinsons of Amherst was built on 2 centuries of settler colonialism that robbed the Native people of their lands and traditional ways of life. By the time of Dickinson's birth and during her lifetime, bigotry based on the imagined and racial superiority of white people was a part of the culture of Dickinson. Though Emily Dickinson was well educated, politically connected, and had a network that included social justice advocates, she does not demonstrate consistent consideration of Native people in her community nor beyond. Thank you all for your time. Over to you, Judith.
Judith, I think you are still muted.
How's that?
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thanks to Becky for a really informative few minutes with us. And now we're going to take our next focus to travel through the decades with Emily Dickinson in Amherst. The town of Amherst changed dramatically during her lifetime, with the rise of manufacturing, the arrival of the railroad her father had promoted, the growth of Amherst College and later the Agricultural College, and changes in the population due to an increasing demand for laborers, a role fulfilled first by African Americans and later also by Irish Americans. Decade by decade, Dickinson's life is shaped in different ways by prevailing perceptions of African Americans and Irish immigrants and their presence in her family's story. When Emily Dickinson was born in 1830, the census recorded 50 Black people living in Amherst, most of whom were laborers and domestics. Though Dickinson was too young in her early years to appreciate her father's conservative politics, she was surrounded by them throughout her life. During Dickinson's first 10 years, the early debate in Amherst about slavery was dominated by the view of the colonizationists, who advocated removal of free Blacks back to Africa because they could never be equal to white Americans. Amherst College was a stronghold for this position, and Edward Dickinson was an outspoken secretary of the Amherst and Amherst College American Colonization Society. He spoke at the anniversary of the Hampshire Colonization Society's gathering held that year in Amherst in 1834. The Northampton Courier reported on the proceedings. I quote from the paper, "We admire the spirit exhibited and the determined opposition to the rash and futile and wanton measures of the immediate abolitionists." Next, challenging the colonizationists in 1833, 8 students at Amherst College, believing that slavery was unchristian, formed the Amherst Auxiliary Anti-Slavery Society and advocated for immediate emancipation. Throughout Emily Dickinson's girlhood, the debate between abolition and colonization carried on. By the end of the decade, the town of Amherst and the North and South Amherst parishes weighed in on the side of abolition because they came to view slavery as a sin and a violation of Christian doctrine and the nation's principles. Noteworthy is that First Church, the church the Dickinsons attended, was hesitant to address the question of slavery and did not formally do so, even though some members of the church were ardent abolitionists. Next. Writing to his wife after returning to Boston in January 1839, Edward's views are again clear. J.S. Adams tells me that there has been a little stir about abolition since I came away. I fear that this exciting subject may yet make us a vast deal of trouble. I wish people would remain calm and rational on this as well as on other subjects. As state legislator, then state senator, and later a member of the U.S. Congress, Edward Dickinson maintained his conservative politics. He eventually opposed the expansion of slavery into the West, and though he disapproved of slavery, he believed the Constitution protected it under states' rights. By age 10 in 1840, Emily Dickinson would have been able to understand that the debate about slavery had real-life consequences. 1 year older than Emily, Angeline Palmer, a freeborn African-American and an orphan, was a ward of the town of Amherst and was hired out to the Shaw family of Belchertown. The Shaw family had a secret plan to take Angeline south and sell her into slavery. But her half-brother, Lewis Fraser, heard about the plan and approached the Amherst selectmen, who did not become alarmed. Fraser then enlisted the help of 2 other young Black men, and together they rescued Angeline and took her to safety. Next. Fraser, along with William Jennings and Henry Jackson, who would later become a trusted courier for Edward Dickinson, were arrested for kidnapping along with Amherst's white deputy sheriff, Henry Frink. Edward Dickinson defended the 4 rescuers, and while Frink was acquitted, the 3 young Black men were convicted. After refusing to tell of Palmer's whereabouts, they were given a 3-month jail sentence. Not only the community, but also the jailkeeper, Mr. Clapp, saw these Black men as heroes, and they were allowed to leave jail in the daytime if they returned at night. A reporter from the Northampton Courier on December 4th, 1840 wrote, "Had the selectmen of Amherst interfered, and as was their right, not to say their duty, forbidden the removal of the girl from the Commonwealth, all this trouble and expense might have been saved." What 10-year-old Emily Dickinson made of this event, we can only imagine. And sadly, Angeline Palmer's story is not unique. For freeborn Black children in New York, for example, frequently disappeared, while New York officials ignored parents' pleas for help. Next. As Dickinson became a teenager, the presence of Irish immigrants further diversified the population of Amherst. The family of John Slater was the first Irish Catholic family to settle in Amherst in 1840. At that time, Amherst was described as having a charm for all but the Catholics. Though locally and nationally, sympathy arose for the Irish during the famine. In Massachusetts, for example, Governor Briggs designated April 8, 1847, as a day of public fasting, humiliation, and prayer, as he appealed for support for Ireland. The North Amherst Congregational Church sent 154 bushels of corn, North Hadley Village $32, Northampton $600, and the Amherst College sophomore class $40. It is noteworthy that Governor Briggs was a friend of Edward Dickinson, who served on the governor's very own council. Briggs and his wife had been overnight guests at the Dickinsons, which gave Emily an advantage when her friend Abaya Root wrote to say that she had met an important political figure. Emily responded, "You don't know how I laughed at your description of your introduction to Daniel Webster." Next. "You must feel quite proud of the acquaintance, and I hope we will not and I hope will not be vain in consequence. However, you don't know Governor Briggs, and I do, so you are no better off than I. Next. If Emily was impressed, if Emily was impressed with the governor's concern about the famine, it was short-lived. The Irish in Ireland was one matter. The Irish on these shores was quite another. Dickinson did not show much sympathy when Austen struggled teaching Irish boys in Boston. Vinnie and I say masses for poor Irish boys' souls. So far as I am concerned, I should like to have you kill some. There are so many now, there is no room for Americans. Nationwide, the large numbers of Irish immigrants gave rise to anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant sentiments, and Amherst historians recount that the presence of Irish immigrants crossed the grain of the resident Congregationalists, who viewed the newcomers as invaders and upsetters of the social order. Next. Such nativist views fueled the national popularity of the Know Nothing Party, which Austen Dickinson supported. Anti-Irish stereotypes appeared in newspapers and magazines Dickinson read, and she herself would not hesitate later to use a stereotype of the Irish in her poem The Spider as an Artist, where she refers to every broom and Bridget, Bridget being a derogatory term for Irish housemaids considered here on equal terms with a broom. In the 1850, the federal census records 84 Irish and 79 Blacks, compared to nearly 3,000 white people in Amherst. Early in this decade, as the poet began making her first strides as a writer, the Dickinsons began to hire daily domestic workers, initially from both minority groups. For 2.5 years, Mrs. Mack, referred to as Little Emerald Mack, worked for the Dickinsons, doing the daunting task of laundry and other housework. In a letter, Emily Dickinson reported, "Little Emerald Mack is washing. I can hear the warm suds splash. I just gave her my pocket handkerchief, so I cannot cry anymore." While Mrs. Mack was taking on household chores, Dickinson was absorbing some of her language patterns. In a letter to Austen, she wrote, "I wouldn't wonder if home were thinking of Austen, and it seems so natural for one to think of the other. Perhaps it is no superstition or omen of this evening. No omen at all, as Mrs. Mack would say." While Irish immigrants had to contend with bigotry, African Americans were faced with the dangers of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which stipulated that fugitives could be returned to their owners even if they were caught in a free state, and all citizens were required to assist in finding fugitives who had no rights to a jury trial. In reality, free Blacks were also abducted, and in Boston, posters warned all Blacks to be on the lookout for kidnappers. Mrs. Sally Ann Brown Scott was an African-American housekeeper working for the Dickinsons in 1853. With her husband, who was employed as a butcher, they raised 4 children and took care of Mrs. Scott's mother. Were they worried about the fugitive slave law and having a family member disappear, as Angeline Palmer almost had 10 years earlier? Did working for a prominent family like the Dickinsons offer Mrs. Scott and her family any security? Was Jeremiah Holden, a Black stableman who worked for the Dickinsons, really in awe of Austen as Emily claimed, or was it safer for him to be closely associated with the Dickinson family to protect his own family of 5? Either way, we know Dickinson stopped by the Holden home spontaneously at times and lamented Holden's departure when the time came. "Jerry is so kind and pleasant that I can't bear the thought of his going away," she wrote to Austen. Emily's affection for Holden is a rare instance, and in her existing letters, we do not see frequent mention of other Black servants in the Dickinsons' employ. Mrs. Eliza Thompson, for example, took time out from her regular job as a servant to an Amherst College professor to help out at the annual commencement tea held at the Dickinsons' home every year. She was an industrious woman, and with her musical husband, Charles, they were able to earn enough money to buy their own home. Mr. Thompson was a short-term laborer for the Dickinsons and a long-term caretaker of Amherst College, where he was affectionately known as Professor Charlie. He was the lead pallbearer at college president Stern's funeral because of his long-standing relationship and mutual friendship with the Stearns family. Dickinson says very little about her contact with this couple, who were talented and accomplished at their work. Emily Dickinson would have encountered both Irish immigrants and African Americans beyond the boundaries of the family mansion. Between the ages of 9 and 24, the poet lived with her family in a different Amherst house at the center of town, located very near the tenement house known as the Beehive. The tenement was home to low-income families, whose presence Dickinson could not have avoided noticing. At the Beehive in 1855, there were 7 Black people with the name Jackson. Of the 26 Irish residents, 5 were single people along with 5 families. When an Irish immigrant, Catherine Calcor, married Alexander Taylor, a Black man, a group of Irish men caused a disturbance at the Beehive when they went there to protest this union, which was the first interracial marriage of record in Amherst. Happenings at the Beehive did not go unnoticed. By the time Emily Dickinson was 25 and the family had returned to the homestead on Main Street, they began phasing out African American laborers in favor of Irish stablemen, maids, and gardeners. In 1855, Edward Dickinson hired their first full-time maid, Margaret O'Brien. When O'Brien left the homestead after 10 years to get married, Dickinson's comment is striking. "I winced at her loss because I was in the habit of her. And even a new rolling pin has an embarrassing element, but to all except anguish, the mind soon adjusts." At age 30 in 1860, Dickinson was beginning to remove herself from the usual social contacts expected of women in her class, as she withdrew into her father's house and grounds. Her correspondence with friends far and wide would keep her engaged with long-standing relationships. Samuel Bowles, editor of the Springfield Republican, was such a close friend and correspondent. Next. In his 1860 editorial, "What is to be Done with the Darkies," which appeared in his highly respected paper, he described the enslaved who had recently arrived in Key West as wild Africans with no knowledge of a civilized life, a filthy, miserable set. And then he goes on to mention Mr. Fred Douglass, a genius, a man of great power, but he apparently never dreams of anything better for his race than freedom and mixture with white society. Social equality with whites can never be had, so these Key West Negroes must be sent back. Certainly, Frederick Douglass dreamed of freedom, having achieved his own from escaping slavery. He had visited Northampton frequently to join his friend David Ruggles, a Black abolitionist who had worked almost to his death helping escapees, including Douglass, on New York's Underground Railroad. Douglass, Ruggles, and Sojourner Truth, who resided at the Utopian community in Northampton for a few years, had long been public figures in the area and in the nation. Next slide. Aligning with the views of these Black abolitionists was another white friend and correspondent of Dickinson. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was not only a literary figure who supported women writers, he was equally known as a staunch abolitionist who supported John Brown and who led the first regiment of free Blacks in the South during the Civil War. In their correspondence, Dickinson seldom refers to or inquires about Higginson's political work. Was she disinterested in either Bowles or Higginson's opposing views? Was she limited by her own emotional crisis in the early 1860s and the subsequent turmoil of the Civil War? With the Civil War well underway, one of Dickinson's poems from this time is Color, Caste, Denomination. It highlights the democratizing of death, and it may be a reference to the loss of Robert Gould Shaw and the Black soldiers of the 54th Regiment. The poem begins, color, caste, denomination, these are time's affair. Death's diviner classifying does not know they are. As in sleep, all hue forgotten, tenets put behind, death's large democratic fingers rub away the brand. While Dickinson emphasizes death's democratic figures in the afterlife, the absence of any challenge to the inequality of this life that was evident in Amherst is noteworthy in her work. Amherst did not escape Civil War deaths. Approximately 60 young men would perish either during the war or from wounds and diseases that later took their lives. A close friend of Austin's, Fraser Stearns, met his death early in the war and may have influenced Austin's decision to pay for a replacement when he was conscripted. The fee was $300, and many privileged white men in Amherst paid for someone to go in their place. Some of these substitutes were Black men who served in the 5th Massachusetts Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. From Amherst, a total of 22 Black men volunteered to fight in the war, 7 of whom died in the South from wounds or disease. As soldiers, they faced discrimination within the Union forces. For example, in Massachusetts regiments, Black soldiers were paid less and given the most physically demanding tasks. Especially egregious was their assignment repeatedly to be the rear guard troops when the Union Army retreated. Black soldiers' lives, it seems, were deemed more expendable than white soldiers' lives. In the Civil War service records for Amherst appear the names of 16 Irish immigrants. Nationwide, over 140,000 Irish immigrants fought for the Union, and approximately 30 to 40,000 fought for the Confederacy. Irish Catholic soldiers were often volunteering to prove they were worthy of assimilation and citizenship. An Irish historian, Mary Kelly, reports that their service would be a critical factor in the decline of nativist hostility toward famine survivors. There is some evidence this was the case in Amherst. After the Civil War, the population of Black people in Amherst only slightly increased to 91. The population of Irish immigrants, however, increased from 160 in the 1860 census to 240 by 1870. In 1869, 2 new hired helpers appeared at the homestead. Margaret Marr became the full-time maid, and Tom Kelly attended the Dickinsons as a laborer. Emily called Margaret Maggie and described her as warm, wild, and mighty, the north wind of the family. She and Tom would be the poet's companions and emotional support for the last 17 years of Dickinson's life. When Emily feared a loved one might die, she turned to Tom. She told a friend, "I ran to his blue jacket and let my heart break there. That was the warmest place." These relationships tempered Dickinson's youthful prejudice against Irish immigrants. In contrast, Dickinson's racial prejudice against Black people was still evident. Years later, when she wrote upon the arrival of a new hired helper, next slide, please. "We have a new Black man at the homestead. Every time he presents himself, I run." While the 1870s brought personal upheaval for the poet, at this time there was a significant development for the Irish and Black communities in Amherst. After 50 years of supporting Sabbath schools for African Americans, Amherst College trustees approved the use of college land for a chapel, and after fundraising in the Black community, Zion Chapel came into being. By 1871, St. Bridget's Church was constructed, also after years of community fundraising, and for the first time, masses could be said in a church in Amherst. Though Amherst's landscape was growing and changing, in the final decade of the poet's life, discrimination was still inherent in her Amherst community, with newspapers reporting on conflicts between African Americans and Irishmen. By the 1880s, Dickinson's health was declining, and she died on May 15, 1886. At the end, she remained loyal to the Irish helpers and requested Tom Kelly and the Irish farmhands carry her casket to her grave. Death's large democratic fingers welcomed her into the unknown as questions of color, caste, and denomination continued to challenge Amherst and the nation. Thank you for coming and joining us tonight. And now it's over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Judith, and thanks to everybody who's joining us this evening. I'd like to begin with a quote from jazz musician Eric Dolphy, who said, "When you hear music, after it's over, it's gone in the air. You can never capture it again." One evening in 1854, after finishing her household chores, Emily Dickinson embarked on a stroll about town. "Then I worked until dusk," a 23-year-old Dickinson wrote to her brother Austin. "Then I went to Mr. Sweetser's to call on a buy a root. Then I walked around to Jerry's and made a call on him, and then hurried home to supper." Jerry is believed to be referred to Jeremiah Holden, who worked as a stableman for the Dickinsons. In the second half of the 19th century, between the Evergreens and the Homestead, the Dickinsons employed about 80 servants, most of them from the Black community or the Irish immigrant community. What was the intention of Dickinson's stroll that day? Was she meandering through town haphazardly, or calling on these households with a purpose in mind? What would she have seen and heard on her excursions about town? Scholar George Boswick notes, "It was not unusual for Dickinson to visit the homes of these servants, witness their music making, and borrow from it for her own inspiration and enjoyment. The vernacular tunes that informed her music book were the same ones that she would have had heard from the servants and others who provided opportunities for listening or music making both inside and outside the parlor setting, and in which Dickinson herself participated." Yet while Dickinson delighted in the music of a diversifying America and Amherst, she often clung to bigoted attitudes regarding the African Americans and Irish immigrants she often interacted with. In a July 1851 letter, again to her brother Austin, Dickinson notes, "We have one foundling hen into whose young mind I seek to instill the fact that Massa is a comin'. The garden is amazing. Old Amos weeds and hoes and has an oversight of all thoughtless vegetables." Here, Dickinson refers to groundskeeper Amos Newport, a Black man. What did the musical landscape of Emily Dickinson's Amherst look and sound like? How was it reflective of American culture at large at that time? And how was this musical culture influenced by African Americans and Irish immigrants, particularly those in Amherst who worked for the Dickinsons and other prominent families like them? In this presentation, I will focus on the African American influences in the popular music enjoyed by the poet. Dickinson's lifetime, from 1830 to 1886, saw a rise in print culture and celebrity culture that went hand in hand. The Dickinsons were avid readers of popular newspapers and magazines of the day, many of which often advertised and reported on musical concerts, such as the performance of renowned opera singer Jenny Lind, as who the press dubbed the Swedish Nightingale, and who Dickinson saw in person at the Edwards Church in Northampton in 1851 July, as part of a grand tour organized and promoted by P.T. Barnum, later more famous for the circus that bore his name. Dickinson, who played the piano, also collected over 100 pieces of printed piano sheet music, often including Irish and Scottish jigs, as well as minstrel music marketed as plantation songs to the parlor audience of the privileged white class to which the Dickinson family belonged. As early as the first decades of the 19th century, it was becoming clear that Americans liked novelty, songs and musical styles drawing on various schools of national song brought to America by new immigrants, writes scholar Charles Ham. The aristocratic cultures of 18th century Europe that had spawned and nourished the classical style were of little or no concern to vast numbers of Americans who preferred the fresh and wild sounds of Irish and Scottish song, the cloying seductions of the new school of Italian opera, and the exciting and amusing minstrel songs combining the Neo-African sound of the banjo with Irish-Scottish melodies. White Americans' frenzy for the music of Black Americans is well documented in this period, even as white Americans sought to uphold imagined racial hierarchies. This cultural dissonance was most often reflected in the popular minstrel music and performances of the day. Even though it was masquerading as farce and comedy and dance in the form of music, says jazz musician and musical scholar Wynton Marsalis, and it seemed like it was uncomplimentary, actually there was something centrally American about it. And that was the beginning of a long relationship between Blacks and whites, and Black entertainment and white appropriation of it, and this strange dance that we've been doing with each other since really the beginning of a relationship in America. An incredibly popular genre, usually performed by whites in blackface and based on stereotyped depictions of African Americans, minstrel troupes traveled the country performing in cities and small towns alike. These smaller halls and performance venues could be found in the Connecticut River Valley. Whether Dickinson or any member of her family attended any of these minstrel shows is not yet known, but such shows were often advertised and reported in the local newspapers they routinely read. In May of 1886, the Hampshire Express ran an advertisement for Parker's Negro Minstrel Group to perform at Agricultural Hall. The Springfield Republican advertised concerts for groups including the Ethiopian Vocalists, the Virginia Serenaders, and the New Orleans Serenaders Opera Company. One particular advertisement from September 20th, 1850, noted that the Fellows' Ethiopian troupe would perform at Hampden Hall for 2 nights, featuring S.A. Wells, the original tambourinist, the primo basso of Dumbleton's Ethiopian Serenaders, G. Warren White, formerly of the same troupe, and E. Horn, alias Brother Bones, the great Ethiopian performer, making in all the most talented corps that had ever visited this place. During Dickinson's day, minstrel shows were not just popular, but accepted by polite society as well. By 1854, minstrel performances were filling theaters in New York City, where they attracted large audiences, including Charles Dickens and Davy Crockett. The minstrel troupe, calling itself the Ethiopian Serenaders, received an invitation to perform at the White House by President John Tyler in 1844. Thomas Daddy Rice's trademark skit, Jump Jim Crow, was so popular that he traveled to London to perform it. Before Stephen Foster's Oh, Susanna was published in 1848, no American song had sold more than 5,000 copies of sheet music. Oh, Susanna sold over 100,000 copies. Music publishers began selling sheet music arrangements of popular minstrel tunes, complete with simple piano accompaniments and illustrated covers, making them highly collectible. Beyond collecting minstrel tunes such as Old Dan Tucker and the Jolly Raftsmen for her book of piano sheet music, Dickinson was clearly familiar with these songs and made references to them in her correspondences. In a January 1850 letter, she asked her uncle Joel Warren Norcross, "Have you found Susanna yet?" And in an August 1860 letter, to Samuel Bowles, family friend and editor of the Springfield Republican, she references Mrs. Jim Crow. Scholar Dale Cockrell notes, the word minstrel would not be applied to those who performed in comic blackface until 1843, but blackface minstrelsy was already in place by 1834. There is no question that the skeleton around which this popular entertainment was built was the denigration of Black people. With the publishing of minstrel sheet music, people like Dickinson could participate in this entertainment whether or not they attended a live performance. Lyrics of popular minstrel tunes like Old Dan Tucker, which Dickinson incorporated into her music book, as we see here, were often adapted for various political and social causes. In 1844, the Whig Party offered this rendition for their presidential candidate, Henry Clay of Kentucky. Get out of the way, you're all unlucky, clear the track for old Kentucky. A variation of the tune was often also sung by the popular abolitionist Hutchinson family singers, which they called Get Off the Track. Get out of the way, every station, clear the way for emancipation. The Hutchinson family singers were associated with the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, the utopian abolitionist community in nearby Florence, Massachusetts, and performed in Dickinson's Connecticut River Valley many times, including in Amherst. They even performed at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary while Dickinson was a student there, though it cannot be said for certain whether or not she attended the concert. Dickinson collected music associated with the Hutchinson family singers. She also collected music by minstrel troops, the Virginia Minstrels and the Harmonian family. In June 1867, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, former Civil War officer, abolitionist, Unitarian minister, and longtime correspondent and future publisher of Emily Dickinson, wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly on Negro spirituals, based on the songs he heard while serving with a regiment of formerly enslaved African-American soldiers in South Carolina. Almost all of their songs were thoroughly religious in tone, Higginson tells his readers, which included the Dickinsons, who were avid subscribers of the Atlantic. By 1860, each church in Amherst, had a choir, which would be accompanied by an organ, viola, or bass violin. The first church serving Amherst Black community was Zion Chapel, built in 1869 on Amherst College property. But members of the church had been worshiping together at various homes of parishioners since 1825. Music was always a central aspect of both social gatherings and religious services. White churches in Dickinson's Amherst also hosted concerts by African-American glee groups, such as the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who performed at First Church, where the Dickinson family were members multiple times. The first time the Fisk Jubilee Singers came, they replaced the choir at the First Church on a Sunday morning, writes scholar James Tryon. They were Negro singers singing spirituals, and this visit was shortly after the Civil War. When they sang Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, the congregation was particularly moved by their deep, sweet voices because many in the Puritan congregation had sent sons to war with the South who had not returned. One such soldier was Fraser Stearns, family friend of the Dickinsons and son of the president of Amherst College, the Reverend Dr. William Stearns. Fraser Stearns died during a battle in New Bern, North Carolina. His body was brought back to Amherst by Charles Thompson, an African-American laborer who worked for both the Dickinson family and the Stearns family. Thompson was also a skilled musician who played the fiddle. Thompson began working for the Stearns family when they lived in Boston in the 1940s. In the 1840s. In 1847, Thompson left to work as a sailor on the whaling ship Warren, traveling all the way to Honolulu, Hawaii. In 1851, he once again embarked on a voyage around the world, this time on a ship called the Kremlin. When Thompson returned to Boston in 1853, he resumed working for the Stearns household. Thompson moved to Amherst with them when William Stearns became president of Amherst College. In 1857, Charles Thompson married Eliza Anthony, who became Eliza Thompson. Eliza Thompson often worked at the Dickinson house when they hosted the annual Amherst College commencement tea. Charles and Eliza's marriage was performed by William Stearns. Fraser Stearns served in the Civil War with the 21st Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers. Charles Thompson went with him, working as a servant of the regiment's assistant surgeon. After the war, Thompson worked as head janitor at Amherst College, as he would for the rest of his life. He was known to the nearly all-white student body, apparently endearingly, as the professor of dust and ash. In 1902, in part in an effort to raise money for an aging Charles Thompson, Fraser Stearns' sister, Abigail Eloise Stearns Lee, wrote her recollections about him in Professor Charlie, a sketch of Charles Thompson. She described him teaching many of the local children, including her brother Fraser, to dance and play the fiddle. She wrote, "But it was Charlie's musical ability that made us love him. As a companion in the evening, for Charlie owned a fiddle, and when he played Money Musk or some lively jig, the children could not help dancing." She noted that her brother Fraser tried to play as well. Writing to her close cousin Louise Norcross in March 1862, Dickinson references the musical abilities of the recently deceased Fraser Stearns. "We will play his tunes," she wrote, "maybe he can hear them." Another musical member of Amherst Black community was Perry Roberts, who was born into slavery in Maryland and emancipated as a child. Roberts worked as a janitor and wait servant for Amherst College. One of his children was Gil Roberts, who became a well-known jazz musician who played with Louis Armstrong and Josephine Baker, was part of the music and art scene of 1920s Paris, France, and was later honored at the Newport Jazz Festival in Rhode Island. He also worked as a janitor at Amherst College. Gil Roberts acquired his musical skills from members of his family, including his father, Perry Roberts, as well as members of Amherst's Black community, says local historian Anika Lopes. Music was an essential aspect of the Black community. Roberts and others would often play music at each other's homes as a way to both express themselves and enjoy each other's company after work, when they were freed from the performative aspects of working as servants. Gil Roberts was remembered in 2012 in the Amherst magazine by Ulrich Haynes Jr., class of 1952, who wrote, "As a 16-year-old Black freshman from Brooklyn, I craved the guidance of someone with firsthand knowledge of Amherst, our nation, and the world. Gil was that person." Whether or not Charles Thompson, Perry Roberts, or other African-American musicians led more formal dance gatherings in and around Amherst is unknown. But during Dickinson's lifetime, such a practice, resembling a hoedown or square dance, was common. Sometimes dance gatherings were held in a local barn. In August of 1858, the Hampshire and Franklin Express ran a lengthy article describing just such a barn dance on the property of a Mr. Cowes that featured an unknown musician. Soon an organ grinder appeared on the grounds. Where he came from or how he got there, no one knew, the article reads, and for a while his instrument added not a little amusement to the company. Mr. Cowles conceived at once of clearing the floor of his spacious barn and was at once occupied as a dance hall. The organ furnished the music, and all ages mingled in the dance with a hearty goodwill. For once, the lookers-on probably enjoyed the sport quite as much as those who, with the feet, kept time to the music as well as they could. It was such a dance only as such a place and such a circumstance could bring out. In January 1861, the Hampshire Franklin Express included a notice that 3 unnamed dance instructors would be offering lessons on the property of an A.P. Howe. This appears to be the same A.P. Howe whose barn was later used as a makeshift hospital in April of 1864, to which the mostly Black and Irish residents of the downtown Amherst tenement building known as the Beehive were relocated due to an outbreak of smallpox. The whole swarm of residents of the Beehive were moved to Howe's barn in between Amherst and Hadley, reports the Hampshire Franklin Express. The hive is at present unoccupied, an occurrence unknown for many years. Just over a year later, the Beehive was demolished by its new owners. This practice appears to have been an agreement of the sale, according to local Amherst historian Ed Wilford. The old Beehive yielded to the pressure of circumstance on Saturday last and came down, the Hampshire Franklin Express reported in July of 1865. Only a pile of debris marks the spot where it once proudly reared its walls. The melodious sounds which ofttimes filled the midnight air no longer hover over it, and busy feet no longer tread the mazy dance through its spacious halls. All is peace and quietness, save when some sable voice in the solemn hours of night lifts up a wail of lamentation over the ruins of its former greatness. As depicted in the article, the Beehive was a site of frequent music making and dancing right in the middle of downtown Amherst. There were also several more established venues in and around Dickinson's Amherst that regularly hosted dances. In January 1867, the Hampshire Express noted that Frank Kingman has fitted up a hall in the Amherst Hall for dancing. A series of cotillions has begun. And in January 1863, the Hampshire and Franklin Express ran an advertisement for a grand ball to be held at the Orient House in nearby Pelham, just up the road from the Dickinson home. Music by Wilson's Quartet Band, the ad continues. The public are respectfully invited. These balls will occur every fortnight. Incidentally, that same year, the Hampshire and Franklin Express reported that the Orient House was being used as a brothel. Scholar George Boswick notes that songs like Old Dan Tucker were featured nightly in bars and brothels and the more reputable concert saloons throughout the border areas of large northeastern cities. Such sites of music were in close proximity to the Dickinson homestead. In the 1860s, the Hampshire Saloon was located in the same building as the Amherst House Hotel, right in the center of town. And Susan Dickinson's father owned several taverns in the area, including the Mansion House during the early 1830s in Amherst, just up Main Street from the house in which Dickinson was born. What influence might these sites of music making have had on Dickinson? Did Susan Dickinson's father share music of the tavern when at home with his children? What musical interest did Susan and Emily share as childhood friends? We don't know. Music was an important part of life at the Evergreens as well as at the homestead. For instance, both of Austin's and Susan's older children, Ned and Martha, learned to play the banjo. In an unpublished memoir, Martha wrote of playing the banjo as a teenager while on an outing in the nearby town of Ashfield. And there is a photo of Ned in the early 1880s participating in a banjo club organized by Amherst College. In an essay called Society at Amherst 50 Years Ago, Susan Dickinson later recalled attending dance gatherings at the home of Dickinson's friends. Emily Fowler had what she called POM, Poetry of Motion, meetings at her house, impromptu dances, if our floundering attempts to get through a Virginia reel or Lancers could be called that, to the sharp voice of an attenuated piano. It was great fun and seemed real. Beside, it was contraband. Emily Dickinson's world was full of music, and she was an active participant in a culture of performing music, dancing to music, and collecting music in an age of evolving cultural tastes. Her musical interest is representative of a privileged white audience that was both intrigued by the new styles of music being played by members of the Black and/or Irish immigrant communities, but determined to feel superior to the members of these communities. This culturally dissonant musical landscape formed more than a backdrop to her creative output, as musical imagery and sound are some of her most commonly used poetic devices. I'll conclude with an excerpt from a poem which uses the image of a violin player. The spirit lasts, but in what mode below the body speaks, but as the spirit furnishes apart, it never talks. The music in the violin does not emerge alone, but arm in arm with touch, yet touch alone is not a tune. Thank you very much for your time, and now I'll send it over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Pete, and thanks to everybody who's here. It's great to be with you all. When we speak of Emily Dickinson's domestic life, issues of labor must be consistently woven through the social fabric of her story. Dickinson's story is one we return to again and again, the way we return to call upon a dear friend to find them at home, writing at their desk. Emily Dickinson's industrious work of writing nearly 1,800 poems, and at the very least over 1,000 extant letters, is a body of work. Her home, the homestead, is often cast within this narrative as a literary and palatial location, home to not only the poet and her family, but to her inspiration and solitude. However, in order to understand Emily Dickinson's home and lifestyle as we have come to know and cherish them, we must also consider the following questions. What did work look like in the homestead and the Evergreens, and who was working? What did Emily Norcross Dickinson, the poet's mother, think about work and household management? And what did Susan Gilbert Dickinson think as she raised her own children and kept house a generation later? Just as importantly, we must zoom out to the surrounding town of Amherst in the 1840s through the 1880s. Who was working in Amherst, Massachusetts while Emily Dickinson wrote her poetry and letters? Through a comparison of these two parallel neighboring households, as well as a look into other nearby sites of industry, this presentation seeks to uncover a landscape of labor in which both surrounded and bolstered Emily Dickinson's daily life, gesturing at the question, how did issues of labor and social reproduction influence her writing practice, and how might her life have been different had she lived and worked in a lower social class? Emily Norcross Dickinson, Emily Dickinson's mother, was in many ways a product of her own mother's life experiences. Her mother, Betsy Norcross, bore the deaths of 4 of her children, including her 2 oldest, Hiram and Austin, who both died in their 20s. When Betsy herself died, her obituary stated that she had to endure throughout her life, quote, severe afflictions, which she was called repeatedly to endure in the sickness and death of children, end quote. Betsy only had 2 children who reached adulthood, Emily, born 1804, for whom the poet is named, and Lavinia, born 1812, for whom the poet's sister is named. Though their father had accumulated wealth during his life, his daughters did not enjoy an easy childhood of leisure. The Norcross house was a converted tavern, and they kept many boarders, typically with only one hired girl at a time. Lavinia Norcross writes about how much care the house needed throughout the girls' childhood and young adulthood, with much of the household work being done by Emily Norcross, who served as Betsy's main help until Lavinia Norcross became old enough to pitch in. Siblings Austin and 5-year-old Nancy died in 1824 when Emily Norcross was 19 years old. Dickinson biographer Alfred Habiger suggests that young Emily Norcross took on the job of being a watcher during her siblings' deaths of tuberculosis, quote, wiping a sweaty forehead, holding a basin for spitting blood, and helping an emaciated figure out of bed. Without a doubt, Emily Norcross Dickinson had a girlhood full of responsibilities and expectations, which then blossomed into an adulthood fanatically insistent upon household cleanliness and orderliness, as well as a personality which developed in a relatively inelastic and melancholic manner. A week before the poet's parents, Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross, married, Edward wrote to assure her of the house's state before they moved in. A week before the wedding, he writes, "The house has been cleaned by a Black woman, but I suppose it will have to pass through other hands again under your own inspection. I told her that if there was one speck left on the windows, they would all be taken out and washed anew. So you see, I have done my duty." Edward's assurance that the house would only be deemed clean when it passed through other hands again, instead of resting with the work of the unnamed Black woman he hired to clean, implies not only his racist view of Black workers being untrustworthy, but also his awareness of Emily Norcross's rigorous standards of housekeeping. When asking her whether they should hire a maid of all work for the house, she replies, "You speak of having a girl. I shall not consent to it at all." Biographers of the Dickinsons have since characterized Mrs. Dickinson as having a strong impulse to control the work of the home, perhaps derived of an individualist, Puritan work ethic, or perhaps influenced by the demands of her most formative years. Perhaps for this reason, she would hold off as long as possible before hiring live-in domestic servants. Lavinia Norcross became concerned for her sister Emily as she adjusted to married life and household management. 3 months after Emily and Edward's marriage, Lavinia writes to her sister, "I hope you will not give up your work in some measure, for mother worries a great deal about you. If you do not favor yourself, I think you will be very ungrateful to your husband and friends. If you cannot do everything you wish about your house, you must consider you are out of health and let all the needless work go. Your health depends on your own prudence, remember." 2 months later, writing, "I understand that your health has not been as good. I hope you will soon have some assistance in our domestic avocations." The year of poet Emily Dickinson's birth, her father Edward gifts The Frugal Housewife by Lydia Maria Child to her mother Emily Norcross Dickinson. Habiger writes that the effect of having such a book on a housewife already inclined to take the business too seriously is easily imagined. Interestingly, the only dog-eared page in Emily Norcross Dickinson's copy is from a page called in the index, "How to Endure Poverty," which you can see in the image on the right. There is a hint of fanaticism in Emily Norcross Dickinson's dedication to tidiness within the home, and also a sense of ever-looming precarity. Having been a homemaker throughout the Dickinson family's inherited financial debts in the late 1830s, as well as her early indoctrination into the world of puritanical work ethics, Emily Norcross Dickinson was reluctant to ease her hold upon the home's inner workings, which was often a source of friction between mother and daughter. Emily Dickinson, the poet, famously writes in May of 1866, "House is being cleaned. I prefer pestilence." Ultimately, though, the Dickinson family did begin to hire domestic laborers. Eva Murray and Deneen Wardrop, in their seminal studies of labor within Dickinson's life, both emphasize the presence of servant labor as the driving force behind the poet Emily Dickinson's productivity. There are many theories about the inspiration for Emily Dickinson's productivity during the 1860s, ranging from the influence of the Civil War to Dickinson's debilitating diagnosis of iritis, a painful eye condition which affected her vision. But perhaps the most compelling theory is that with a maid living in the homestead, Emily and Lavinia Dickinson could feasibly outsource their chores of, for instance, dusting. Emily writes in a letter, "I don't see much of Vinnie. She's mostly dusting stairs." Compellingly, Eva Murray cites, Dickinson wrote no poems and no letters in the year 1857, but when a maid of all work was hired to live and work in the homestead, Emily's composition jumped to 12 letters and 43 poems in 1858. Social reproduction is a term first coined by Karl Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. In detailing the workings of an ever-emergent, industrialized, and oppressive class system, social reproduction is said to be crucial to the reproduction of the working class, and thus capitalism. This domestic labor, whether paid or unpaid, that is done in the home, often by women, this can be domestic labors like cleaning, cooking, child rearing, or literal reproductive labor, is crucial to delivering the working class to the factory or other work setting where their labor power ultimately becomes a part of capitalist production. For the Dickinsons, the introduction of paid domestic labor in the home allowed for Emily Dickinson's time to be freed up, delivering her from her work done in the kitchen to the work done at her writing desk. Still, Emily Dickinson spent a good deal of time working in or being near the kitchen and adjacent washroom as servants Rosina Emerald Mack and Margaret O'Brien did the work of the house's chores. Margaret O'Brien worked for the Dickinson family from 1855 or 1856 to 1865 before Margaret Marr, affectionately called Maggie, began her employment as maid from about 1869 to 1899. Rosina Mack was given the nickname Emerald by the Dickinsons to distinguish her from members of the neighboring Deacon Mack family, and the name Emerald was almost certainly meant as a stereotyping identifier for her roots in Ireland. In 1852, Emily Dickinson writes to Susan, quote, "Little Emerald Mack is washing. I can hear the warm suds splash. I just gave her my pocket handkerchief, so I cannot cry anymore." In a previous sentence in that same letter, Dickinson writes, "I brush away big tears with the corner of my apron and then go working on." Interestingly, Dickinson implies that by handing her handkerchief over to Rosina Mack for washing, Mack can wash her sadness clean. Here we see Dickinson using the arguably puritanical idea that work can wipe grief out. However, she outsources that work to Mack, whose paid labors function not only in the emotional sphere, but in the material and economic as well. It is worth noting that the work that Dickinson performs, which she writes of as being bookended by tears here, would have been far less taxing work than that taken on by servants like Mack, who may not have had the luxury to break from her domestic labors to contemplate her emotions, or even write a letter. 19th century laundering was a notoriously onerous task involving hot water and strong cleaning agents, and often assigned to the lowest of hired women. In 1863, Dickinson writes in another letter to her Norcross cousins, "Margaret washed today and accused Vinnie of calicos. I put her shoe and bonnet in to have them nice when she got home." Playfully, Dickinson again represents herself as a conspiratorial parallel laborer who works but can also reimagine work as a location for play. While Margaret O'Brien does the laundry, Dickinson writes that she might drop Vinnie's shoe and bonnet in the wash, which of course would not just clean the garments and add more work for Margaret, but ruin them. This scene, which Dickinson constructs in humor, uses the labor of her servant as a backdrop for her prank, again highlighting Dickinson's desire to portray herself as adjacent to the domestic labor of the home, yet still able to exit from systems of labor when she chooses, revealing her privileged position as a woman who can access mobility through the very social classes she helps to maintain. Meanwhile, next door, Susan Gilbert, the mistress of the Evergreens and wife to Emily's brother Austin, was the core intellectual, emotional, and possibly amorous relationship of the poet's life. Though Emily and Sue were born just days apart in December of 1830, their lives and their versions of 19th century womanhood diverged strongly as adults. Her father's father, Colonel Eliel Gilbert, owned a hotel and was elected 6 times to the General Court. Perhaps notably, he was also said to have owned the first piano in Greenfield. The colonel was a prominent patriarch, and Susan's father, Thomas Gilbert, was striving to fill his father's shoes, albeit in a less dashing fashion. While Thomas served 1 term in the state legislature and kept a series of taverns in Greenfield, Deerfield, and Amherst, he was also developing a reputation for being someone who drank to excess. He died in 1841 when Susan was just 11 years old. Her mother, Harriet Arms Gilbert, also died of consumption when Sue was only 6 years old. As an orphaned young girl, she was raised by her aunt, Sophia Van Bronken, who lived in Geneva, New York. For Susan, there must have been considerable pressure in conducting a home mere yards from the homestead where Emily Norcross Dickinson reigned. Under Sue's household management, the Evergreens became a cosmopolitan location where salon-style dinners and fireside chats were legendary and drew a variety of distinguished guests, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, abolitionist Wendell Phillips, and famed landscape designer of New York's Central Park, Frederick Olmsted. In Sue's annals, she writes about the excitement she felt while entertaining Emerson. Before he came, I grew almost nervous in my anticipation with a vision of our New England seer. For years, I had read him, in a measure understood him, revered him, cherished him as a hero in my girl's heart, till there grew into my feeling for him almost a supernatural element, so that when I found he was to eat and sleep under our roof, there was a suggestion of meeting a god face to face, or one of the patriarchs of Hebrew setting, as Aunt Emily says, as if he had come from where dreams were born. It is worth noting also that Susan and Austin's children, who were raised in the 1870s and 80s, enjoyed a Victorian upper-class childhood which was full of celebrations and indulgences which previous generations had lacked. In the Evergreens, there are amazing examples of this kind of cherished childhood in the form of Gibbs toys, including a train reminiscent of the train his grandfather Edward brought to town, an elaborately decorated rocking horse, and a velocipede or tricycle. Dickinsons even allowed their children to paste pictures from books and magazines directly on the nursery walls, as you can see on the right, giving them the freedom to take up space and alter their environment according to their own desires. When Gibb decided to host a circus in the Evergreens yard, the family took it seriously, even printing up tickets for entry. But Gibb and his siblings were not the only children living in the Evergreens. In December of 1852, Emily Dickinson's cousins, the Newmans, became orphaned when both their father and mother died of tuberculosis. The two daughters, Clara and Anna Newman, 14 and 12 years old, were sent to live in Amherst. The Dickinson children did not enthusiastically welcome the Newman cousins to their home. Lavinia was afraid the relations will keep close to us as long as we live, and it annoyed her to watch as Clara and Anna sat, perfectly passive, waiting father's next direction, as if it was a bad thing for him to have that care, end quote. Emily also had a haughty attitude toward the new wards, saying strikingly in a letter to Austin on April 21st of 1853, quote, "The Newmans seem very pleasant, but they are not like us. What makes a few of us so different from others? It's a question I often ask myself," end quote. Anna and Clara's Irish maid, Hannah Newman Fay, was also with the girls when they arrived and was the subject of much ridicule from the family. Austin writes to Sue after hearing that Hannah had been ungrateful. Hannah had recently told a neighbor the Dickinsons had been exclusive and rude to the newcomers. Quote, "Let the woman talk if it makes her any happier. And that miserable, fretful, old maidish widow, Mrs. Fay, let her alone too. If she barks too loud and troubles your sleep, tell father and have him inform her her services are no longer needed and hire some more serviceable girl to take charge of those children. We can turn her out of the house any day and she can't say one word," end quote. Hearing Austin so irreverently threaten Hannah Fay with unemployment further demonstrates the hostile class environment the Newmans were now entering. Ultimately, the Newman sisters were installed at the Evergreens under Austin and Susan's care. This arrangement would last 9 years, even though Austin and Susan never officially adopted the girls. They remained wards of Edward's until they married and were able to leave. While Susan was not thrilled about incorporating the girls into her household, she did take advantage of the Newman girls' presence as free labor. While Susan raised her children, she treated Clara and Anna as volunteer substitute nurses, arguably against their will. The Newmans were not the only children whose labors were used to benefit their family. Some poorer families in Emily Dickinson's Connecticut River Valley used women's and children's labor as outwork to earn income. Outwork provided them with a flexible means of earning small amounts of extra income without excessively disrupting other household and farming tasks. Just up the river from Amherst in Buckland, Massachusetts in 1841, for example, Mary and Lucius Graham, both shoemakers, were planning and saving to move west and enlisted their children to make buttons as a way to generate more income. Mary wrote in February 1842, quote, "Our children are helping us get ready, but they have earned since the forepart of June $70. Classist social commentary of the time praised outwork as a means for preventing idleness among poorer women and children. However, there were economic disadvantages to outwork. It became regarded as light work, suitable for children. There was no distinction between adults and children's wages, and women were often paid at undercut children's rates. As a newspaper editor put it, a nimble-fingered girl of 10 can earn in a day as much as an adult woman. In the 19th century, adults and children were frequently forced to function as part of the labor economy in order to survive, and this work of surviving was happening not just in the surrounding farms of Amherst, but in sites of industry mere feet from Emily Dickinson's doorstep. We do not often think about Emily Dickinson living right across the street from an industrial complex, yet right across the street from the Dickinson homestead and the Evergreens lay the Hills Company Hat Factory, at the time America's largest producer of palm leaf hats. From across the Dickinson meadow at her south-facing bedroom window, the poet would have had an unobstructed view of the factory. While industry had been changing the sights and sounds of Amherst for years, with the railroad noisily passing across Main Street to the east, the Hills Hat Factory emerged as a titan of a complex, with a sprawling campus and large smoke-producing chimneys reminiscent of factories found across larger New England cities like Worcester or Lowell. Besides the work whistles heard from the homestead, there was also the activity of workers and transport vehicles carrying goods to and from the factories and railway stations past Dickinson's window 6 days a week. In an 1873 poem, Dickinson writes of the manufacturing spot, which may be indicative of the Hills factory complex across the street from the homestead. For the families of Amherst and the Connecticut River Valley, palm leaf braiding outwork, which the Hills Hat Factory outsourced and purchased at a discounted rate, was an essential way to earn more income. Letters from a woman named Harriet Nutting of Amherst reveal that in the 1840s, palm leaf braiding for the Hills Hat Factory was a necessary strategy for low-income families to generate extra income, and not a task for idle hands, as was commonly believed by the middle and upper classes. Harriet writes of her chores when her mother and sisters were away from home, saying, "I have to be Hannah and mother in the house and John at the barn, besides braiding double-rimmed hats when there is nothing else to do." Here, Harriet ironically uses the phrase "nothing else to do" to play with the wrongful assumption that the lower classes were lazy. Work like the Nuttings' palm braiding was often met with poor pay. In 1857, 2 girls and a boy in Barre, Massachusetts, completed a record stint of braiding in which they produced 800 hats in 37 days. At 8 cents per hat, they earned an average of only 57 cents a day each, yet well below the daily rate for a farm laborer. Above all, for much of this period, outworkers usually received payment in store goods only rather than cash. Mary Graham, the children's mother, commented in the Hampshire and Franklin Express in June of 1857, "It is all store pay, but it helps a great deal," implying perhaps that cash would have been better. With low pay for their labor, it is no wonder that families usually did outwork only when circumstances absolutely required it. Inside the factory itself, workers' living conditions often fluctuated. Beyond the factory rooms themselves, which were full of plant matter dust that became increasingly dangerous when inhaled, the seasonal nature of palm leaf braiding took its toll on the workers' ability to maintain their income. In 1860, when the Hills factory imported a quantity of palm leaf too tender to weave, Henry F. Hills wrote, "We have not had enough work for the girls all the time, which has made it very unpleasant." A substantial portion of mill workers had to supplement their wages. For example, a majority of textile mill workers in Amherst, Northampton, and Williamsburg either had children work in the mills as well, took boarders into their family, or both. Under these conditions, it was incredibly difficult for most workers to accumulate property. These realities of economic and class precarity were not distant environments for the Dickinsons. Written into the intimacies of the end of Emily Dickinson's life, Austen notably recorded the sound of factory whistles. Austen wrote on May 15th, 1886, quote, "The day was awful. She ceased to breathe that terrible breathing just before the whistles sounded for 6, end quote. By the end of Emily Dickinson's life, American industrialization had grown substantially, becoming integral to nearly all aspects of life. On Dickinson's last day, when she was called back, as it is written on her gravestone, it's somehow fitting that her transit into death would too have been marked by the sounds of the factory whistles which had punctuated her days of writing. The stories we tell about the historic figures we love are urgently important. While it's desirable to claim Emily Dickinson as an exceptional woman living and writing in the 19th century with a universal, expansive reach toward the 21st, It is equally important to situate her within her very lofted second floor location, which, though protected and privileged, can never truly be removed from systems of labor and capital. Understanding Emily Dickinson's Amherst allows us to not just complicate her story, but to excitedly uncover new details that shed light on who the poet was, and importantly, how her poetic vision came to be. Thank you.
Wow, I'm going to offer a round of applause to all of our speakers tonight who are going to join us back on the screen. I want to say a big thank you to these amazing Emily Dickinson Museum tour guides for their research in these presentations. So we heard from Emily Bernhard, Pete Reddington, Judith Hudson, and Becky Lockwood. Thank you to all of you. You've given us a lot to consider and the connections that you've drawn to Dickinson's work and her family and her Amherst home. I want to take a few minutes for Q&A. The evening grows long, but I think we're all having a great time. So I think I'd like to begin with this question for all of you. I'd like for you to tell us a bit more about some of the most useful sources for you in conducting your research. Yeah, jump right on in, Becky.
Okay. I have been fortunate to use the research and to hear in person. These are my favorites. There are many, but I will mention Dr. Lisa Brooks of Abenaki descent, Dr. Marge Bruchak of Abenaki descent, Dr. Nan Wolverton, and David Brule, who is of Nahantic descent. And I've heard them, met them all, used their research. So those are my favorites. There are others as well. My presentation required a great deal of, as we mentioned, searching for people who have been written out of history. And I'm grateful for these folk, particularly who have spent a great deal of time bringing them back to us.
Feel free to chime on in, crew. What else impacted your research? Yeah, go ahead, Judith.
I was particularly appreciative of the librarians in special collections at the Jones Library. Jennifer Bauman and Catherine Whitcomb just are amazing resources and resourceful. Even this afternoon, I had to call and check a name, and Jennifer called back in about half an hour with just what I needed to confirm. And I have been impressed with how many resources there are. I've also really appreciated reading church histories, which I never would have read before this project, because so much of the political activity in the early part of the century was channeled through the churches, and that's been revealing.
I'd like to second Judith's thanks of the special collections folks at the Jones, where I also spent a bit of time reading old newspaper articles from the 1800s and things like that, as well as my conversations with local historian Ed Wilford, who is very knowledgeable, and as well Aniko Lopes, who was also very knowledgeable, and who Ancestral Bridges exhibit at Amherst College was also very informative and insightful.
Yeah, I'll third the thanks to the special collections team at the Jones Library, Catherine and Jennifer. Also the collections staff we have at the museum. Megan was helpful, as well as the collections at Harvard's Houghton Library, the Frost Library at Amherst, and some researchers who I have not met, who I would love to meet, Aoife Murray and Deneen Wardrop, and Christopher Clark, author of The Roots of Rural Capitalism in Western Massachusetts. Those three were great helps.
Well, a huge part of your approach was, for all of you, I know, was in a relatively short amount of time to take in both a lot of reading of secondary sources, scholars who have written about these subjects, while pursuing the primary sources from within Dickinson's time period that help to illustrate the ideas that we want to share. One of our listeners is asking about, he's thinking that you've probably been learning about these topics for a while. How long did it take you to put together your presentation for tonight?
Well, if you want to talk about 12-hour days, the time will appear to be a little shorter than it actually was. But it's hard to quantify it because with Aoife Murray's book, which I was introduced to years ago, just started me on a search since then, and looking at new sources that supplement that groundbreaking work has been fun.
I guess I'd like to say too that I feel really privileged to have been able to, I've always been interested, I've always known that there were Indigenous folk around, but I didn't know anything about them. And to spend the time since February, I guess, hours and hours a week, but trying to find them and finding out the truth was just amazing. So I'm grateful for that.
I think something I would want to acknowledge too is, in addition to spending a huge amount of concerted time and energy on this project, all of these wonderful presenters tonight are also tour guides at the Emily Dickinson Museum. Becky and Judith have been guides for 9 years.
Yes.
Am I right about that? They trained in the same class. Pete and Emily also trained in the same class, and they trained 1 year ago. And I just love that we have some very experienced guides here and some of our newer guides. And this just is such a wonderful illustration of the passion and knowledge that all of our museum guides bring to their work. I also want to mention that the work that these guides have done lays the groundwork for more to come, for the Emily Dickinson Museum, for programs that we will run for you, for the experiences that you will have when you come to visit us. We want to incorporate these stories more, and tonight has been such a wonderful start to that. I know that there have been some other specific questions that we won't be able to get to tonight. I am going to draw us to a conclusion. But I want to thank you to those of you who had some specific questions in the chat. If you are looking for more information, please feel free to send us an email at edmprograms@emilydickinsonmuseum.org. We'd love to try and help connect you to more resources. I want to say thank you again to Becky, Judith, Pete, and Emily for your presentations this evening. Thank you to all of you, our audience, for joining us, for your lively chat and your great questions, for this look at race and class context of Emily Dickinson's Amherst. We will have more programming coming up, both virtually and on site. So if you can make it to Amherst, we'd be glad to see you at the annual Poetry Walk on Saturday, May 13th. We are returning on site for the first time since the pandemic began with this tradition that marks the anniversary of the poet's 1886 death. Then on Thursday, May 18th, we'll be kicking off our Phosphorescence Contemporary Poetry Series with 3 poets reading their work and discussing poetry and Dickinson. That will stream live virtually from the Homestead Parlors. So to learn more about our programs, to sign up for our mailing list, or to make a donation in support of free programs like this one, please visit us at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. Until next time, we wish you well, and thanks for being with us. Good night, everybody.
Thanks.